Formalism. So we've talked about formalism quite a bit when we got into the first function, and I sometimes will tackle that one early because so often when someone looks at a work of art, I'm interested in using the things that were the formalist elements that made it. Like, look at the color brown. This brown is different than this black. That's different than this red. That the choices that we want to see and the design work. So we sometimes look at the formal elements of the work of art. And when we look at works of art that are purely formalist, what we find is that these artists, they give the ultimate power of the work to the design elements and the design choices, the colors, the shapes, the lines, the movement in and of itself for its own sake, and not about its realism or its expressionism, that they just want to see this. This is a Mondrian piece here, and again, we can probably attribute some things to it, but largely this is just a piece of design and a piece of art that is just, we can consider purely formal. And again, I consider that there's feeling in this work, but the feeling is different than emotional, expressionistic feeling. Here are a couple more kinds of images of works of art. And sometimes we use that slogan, the art for art's sake or the dance for dance sake. This is a Donald Judd. And here we have just this kind of sculpture that is just a series of boxes that with a lid that attach to the wall. So they create a rhythm and a pattern. And much of history, we attribute this to the kind of modernism that occurred, to modern art. And again, I like to say that the artists began to remove the realistic elements and the emotional elements, and they created abstractions. And sometimes they did this because they didn't want us to just view the work as something. They just wanted us to live and see the work in and of itself for its own sake. So they tended to throw the subject matter and the emotional matter out the window. Yeah. This is a Calder, a great mobile. And even with a work like this, the movement of the work, of how this mobile moves, is part of what happens. And what the biggest thing that they did was they also threw out perspective, which was a crowning glory of the Renaissance. They didn't adhere to that, and they didn't deal with the subject anymore. So here, even though we have a star, this, image, we have this star and this red and these black shapes that float in the air. Now, in dance, some of the romantic narratives, the pantomime, the characters of ballet were moved away from as we got into more of a formalist world. Yeah. In composition, John Cage, Lucia Tukhachevsky, they even rebelled against things like melody. So they got away from some of the emotional attributes. And Ken Johnson, who is an art critic for the New York Times, he said of one of Agnes Martin's paintings and drawings, they don't invite you to look through them to another world, but to gaze at them in the here and now as ends in themselves. So I like this statement because it's like, don't look at this painting to see someplace else. Just look at this to see it. Two formalist movements I want to pay attention to for a moment. One being minimalism. Architect Ludwig Mies van der Rohe is probably the most famous for this, and he made the statement, less is more. Many of you know that statement. You might not know that he said it first. So Mies van der Rohe, if I show you, these are two Mies van der Rohe buildings, very modern buildings. These exist in New York. think they're on the east side. Yeah. So looking at the water. So these are just two simple buildings and minimalism, glass and steel. This is his famous pavilion. And you can see this was recreated in, so if you're in Barcelona, you can go visit Mies van der Rohe's pavilion. This was for the World's Fair, and it just moved architecture into another place, another century of kinds of work. Yeah, the real simple elements. So if you walk to the pavilion, there are these vast spaces with these stones that are just in a shallow pool of water, these pavilions, these places, these simple benches. There's a bookstore on one side, and then he even created the furniture. This is a Mies van der Rohe ottoman here, and you can see even the simpleness of these walls, these granite walls that were cut, these slabs of granite. And this is called bookending, where you can see how the one piece of granite lived on top of the other one when they cut it. So you can see the bookends together. There's only one realistic element in the entire pavilion, and that is this one sculpture that sits here in this water, and this is called the Dawn. Very empty house space. These are two of his chairs. These were modeled after thrones, so this was a very modern throne. So sometimes now this is a classic. This is called the Barcelona chair by Mies van der Rohe, and this is put into very modern houses nowadays. You can see this is the living room. If we go to the other side here, this is probably the bedroom over here that looked at the dawn. And there's also, they don't have the glass table, but this is the glass table. So you can see that X design was part of it. And again, it's a kind of minimalism. Just what is essential? What's the least amount I can put here? This is a Henry Moore sculpture. And people talk about Henry Moore because of the negative spaces of his sculpture. And so here, I love this statement that he says, the first hole made through a piece of stone is a revelation. And a lot of this happened in the 50s, where we moved away from decoration and stripping elements of art down to just a stark, more minimal world. Happened in the dance world too, happened in the theater world also. So in all music, all of the art forms, we started to get to this kind of minimalism. With minimalist music, we had repetition. We just had another image of the same. Here's Alan McCullum's Plaster Surrogates. Tony Smith's Cigarette. I love this. This is a huge sculpture that would sit in a big courtyard or on the mall of a university, and it looks just the shape of like a bent cigarette. The other movement I want to talk about is functionalism, because sometimes you had works of art that were just purely about the function of what happened. This is a Trisha Brown piece in an art gallery where the dancers are in harnesses and they just walk around the sides, the walls of the gallery, while people stand underneath. Yeah. Sometimes you have works of art of this era where they would vacuum the floor. I suppose Rudy Perez is sitting and smoking a cigarette is a kind of functionalism, that we're functionally doing something, and typically it was something that didn't exist in most of the typical world that we were used to in the work of art. Yeah. In the 70s, also dance happenings, different improvisation groups also started to do some of that. And it was moving us out of Well, most of this moved us into an era of modernism, and then as it developed, it was moving us out of that era of modernism to the postmodern era.